Hey everyone! In this entry, we'll be taking a look at Walter Finch from Christopher Nolan's Insomnia, as played by the late great Robin Williams in a rare villainous outing. Walter is a horrifying example of the effects of long-term isolation and misguided affection, combined with a possible history of being a victim of abuse. A man who sought love in the wrong places only to be spurned, and in the attempt to preserve what remains of his self-image, succumbed to the heat of the moment and committed the heinous act of murder. A crafty and chilling man whose quiet existence is betrayed by his misguided sense of morality. At face value, there isn't anything too remarkable about the man that is Walter Finch. His appearance is rather plain and mundane, but upon a closer look at his mannerisms, his facial expressions, and the tone of his gentle and low voice, his chief attribute appears to be that of a chronic sadness, and we find Walter to be a very subdued and soft-spoken individual, one whose default look is somber and downcast. As indicated earlier, Walter's past is one that is possibly marked by abuse. The first thing we can confirm about Walter's background is that he wasn't born in Alaska, but moved there at some point. We don't know if Walter had committed any crimes in the past, but as suggested by the film, there are only two kinds of people in Alaska: those who were born there and those who are running away from something. While Walter is likely innocent prior to the events of the film, it's a strong possibility that he has a past he wishes to put behind him, one that has emotionally scarred him and resulted in his social isolation. It's worth noting that he could live anywhere in the world, yet he willingly chooses to dwell in a location as obscure as Alaska, in spite of the disruption in day and night cycles causing him many sleepless nights. He does provide some hint regarding the appeal of the location after the death of Kay, citing his modest opinion of the local residents, the fact that they wouldn't dare to look into the eyes of a killer. Walter's family situation is ambiguous, but from the fact that he only mentions his grandmother when recounting his holiday to Portland, it's likely that he did not have a conventional upbringing, the reasons for which we can only speculate. The biggest hint, however, that we have concerning Walter being a victim of abuse is his attitude of disgust and fury against Randy, a perpetrator of domestic violence with his girlfriend, Kay. Although Walter was the one who committed the act of murder, he is exceptionally quick to take the moral high ground, with no qualms about framing Randy and condemning him to jail as if he committed the greater crime. Of course, in some part, this hostility towards Randy arises out of jealousy, as he is the one whom Kay truly loves. But Walter also appears to take a slippery slope argument with Randy, being unusually sure that he would soon degenerate into worse behavior. Abuse is never justified, but the fact that Walter has such a knee-jerk adverse response to the notion of it suggests that perhaps he has had a personal brush with it in the past, leading to his current attitude towards Randy. Since his youth, Walter was always inclined to law enforcement, even aspiring to become a police officer, but this hope was dashed when he failed the entry tests. This inclination towards law enforcement, however, would live on in Walter's profession as an author, writing detective mystery novels aimed at the young adult demographic. This choice of topic for Walter's writings is perhaps another hint at his traumatic past. In the detective mystery genre, one is bound to become involved in topics such as crime, evasion of the law, evil intentions, and forensic science, to name a few. Now, of course, there are a myriad of reasons that give the detective mystery genre its appeal to a large audience, such as escapism and the adrenaline rush. But for Walter, we can surmise that his mental and emotional health is questionable to begin with, especially given his choice to isolate himself and his chronically sad demeanor previously discussed. In light of his possible history with abuse, this makes his mental frame even more tenuous. Therefore, as a suggestion, perhaps Walter's fascination with the crime drama and its grisly topics is a way for him to process his own trauma, a method for him to feel at home by vicariously living out his past tragedies through creating fictional stories revolving around those same elements. This fascination with crime mysteries gives Walter his competitive edge, an intricate insight into the workings of law enforcement, covering everything from investigation procedure to forensic evidence, a knowledge that he uses to evade the long arm of the law, indicated by how methodical and cautious he is in the removal of bodily evidence upon the murder of Kay. A knowledge that keeps him craftily on his toes, highlighted by his setting up of wild cards as insurance and directing the investigation to a conclusion befitting of a fictional mystery. Beyond this meticulous side, this act of removing bodily evidence also conveys another element of Walter, albeit a more disturbing one, his level of calmness in the aftermath of taking someone's life. As Detective Dormer puts it, he crossed the line and didn't even blink. There's no coming back from that. This level of calmness, combined with a blatant lack of remorse, would both perhaps indicate some level of sociopathic tendencies within Walter, which could possibly have its origin in the suggested history of abuse. An important distinction needs to be made. Walter does display some level of regret over Kay's death, but hardly any remorse, if any, instead choosing to downplay his murder by the fact that it was an accident and beyond his control. At one point, he even goes so far as to say that whatever he's feeling is not guilt, and after confiding in Dormer over the events of her death, he mentions that he'll finally be able to sleep. A rather chilling depiction of calmness after committing the most heinous of crimes. And this is also highlighted with the earlier mention of how Walter was so nonchalant over his new identity as a killer, when he mentions that the locals wouldn't dare look him in the eye. Although Walter has chosen to isolate himself, he is not socially handicapped, as we find him to be an eloquent and highly intelligent man in his conversations with Dormer, even displaying a devious level of craftiness in his attempt to evade justice. He exhibits a remarkable level of keen observation in nonverbal cues, as seen by how he noticed that Detective Ellie had caught on to Dormer's lie over the death of his partner. However, despite his sharp level of perception, he misses out on the one crucial aspect in his relationship with Kay, the fact that she has relegated him to the friend zone, and saw him as nothing more than a simp who would buy her designer clothes and serve as an emotional outlet when she undergoes conflict with her actual boyfriend. Perhaps it's a testament to the extent of Walter's loneliness and his need for affection that he would miss out on this. The fact that he kept her dress in his house, despite it being crucial evidence against him, also speaks to his strong affinity towards her. The saying that love is blind is perhaps relevant here, and unfortunately Walter deluded himself into thinking he could be anything more than a platonic friend to Kay, someone who has her own issues with abuse to iron out. In a fateful moment after making an advance on her, Walter is spurned, and unfortunately in a most embarrassing fashion, with the person of his affection cruelly laughing at him. Given Walter's violent reaction, it's suggestible that much of his self-worth was tied up in this relationship, and in that moment of ridicule, I'd imagine that all of Walter's past abuse and loneliness came crashing down on him in an instant, spurring him to contend for what little remains of his self-respect. What makes the situation worse is that Kay has somewhat of a Stockholm syndrome with Randy, which makes Walter confused over her reaction. But he soon crossed the point of no return, and with the death of Kay, Walter knows the ground will soon be closing in on him, given how small their town is. As an opportunist, Walter sees his chance to cover up his crime when he witnesses the incident with Dormer in the midst of the fog. While Dormer himself might be ambiguous about it at the end, personally I feel that the death of Eckhart was a genuine mistake. It's a testament to the crafty manipulation of Walter, combined with the effects of insomnia that Dormer would second-guess himself at the end. We get a greater glimpse as to the extent of loneliness that has enveloped Walter in his interactions with Dormer. For a person blackmailing someone on the other side of the law, Walter is firm yet unusually amicable and accommodating, treating Dormer as if he was an old friend, even going so far as to offer him his bed and asking him to feed his dogs. While he might have the upper hand in terms of controlling the situation, Walter's overtly friendly attitude to Dormer reveals just how desperate his need is for a companion, a need which he feels has been met by their so-called common bond, his opinion that they both have taken a life accidentally. Walter's ability to get into the mind of Dormer speaks to his crafty nature and his skill as a manipulator. A common justification for evil is that of the concept of the greater good, and Walter is quick to wield this excuse, telling Dormer that all the criminals he arrested would go free should he be found guilty of murdering Eckhart. But however much he may try to frame his murder of Kay as an accident in the same vein as Eckhart's death, one huge distinction remains, a distinction which a guilt-ridden Dormer points out after having enough of their criminal partnership, namely the fact that it took Walter 10 minutes to beat Kay to death, while Eckhart's death occurred within seconds. Walter may not have intended to kill Kay, but he could have stopped and brought her to the hospital instead of continuing the act in a state of blind rage. At the end, Dormer's prognosis of Walter's condition turns out to be true, that there's no coming back from this. The murder of Kay irrevocably transformed Walter, and now he is ready to take another life, this time with less hesitation in the case of Detective Ellie, who poses a threat to Dormer's compliance given her suspicion of Eckhart's death. Walter could have finished Ellie off on his own, but perhaps he waited for Dormer to arrive so as to incriminate him in the act together, an act that would forever bind the two of them in the same murder, giving him assurance of mind that all his crimes would forever be swept under the rug. What he underestimated, though, was that Dormer's sense of justice would prevail, and that oftentimes the ends do not justify the means. In hindsight, Walter's story is a chilling reminder of how easy it is to fall into error, especially if we've been victims of the selfishness of others. He was a downcast and dejected man, one whose past was likely riddled with abuse, leading him to a life of isolation and to seek affection in the wrong place. A man plagued by the wounds of his past and the present loneliness, one who in a moment of folly committed the unthinkable and seared his conscience.